The Sterling family dinner was in full swing when Julian Sterling stood up and tapped his fork against Eleanor's best crystal. "Before we eat, I have something important to share," he said, and his voice carried the kind of authority he rarely showed. "You all know about Clara's little cabin. Her impractical purchase 3 years ago." My shoulders tensed at his tone. "Well," he went on, "I finally did something about it. I sold it for $100,000 last month while she was overseas." The words hung in the air. He pointed to the elaborate spread on the table as if it were evidence of his brilliance. "The money for this dinner? It's from the cabin sale. At least one meal is covered." His family laughed and applauded. I stayed silent, my phone already buzzing with the call that was about to change everything. The buyer's lawyer would scream the question again. Why federal authorities were inside their office. And the sheer fear behind it told me I wasn't imagining things. I had suspected something was off and now I had proof. "Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here. If you believe that every woman's achievements deserve recognition, not dismissal, please consider subscribing. It's free and it helps these important stories reach more people. Now let me explain how I ended up at that table, surrounded by people who had made dismissing me into an art form. 6 years of marriage to Julian Sterling had taught me the exact boundaries of my invisibility. That morning, like every morning, I had risen at dawn to prepare his coffee. 2 sugars. No cream. While he scrolled through his phone at our kitchen table, my greeting went unacknowledged as usual. The breakfast I made was eaten in silence, broken only by the sound of his chewing and the occasional notification ping from his fantasy football group. Eleanor called while I was cleaning up. She spoke only to Julian, discussing Sunday's menu, despite knowing I would be the one spending 6 hours in the kitchen meeting her complicated requests. "Make sure Clara knows about the roast," she said, as if I were hired help rather than her daughter-in-law, "and tell her not to oversalt the potatoes like last time." The potatoes had been perfectly seasoned. But in the Sterling family, my efforts were always somehow lacking. That pattern had been established early in our marriage. When I received my promotion at the consulting firm, it came with a 30% raise and a corner office, earned through 18 months of 70-hour weeks. Julian's response was a distracted mumble about how it was about time I contributed meaningfully to our finances. The next evening, his brother Leo scratched off a lottery ticket at that same dinner table and won $100. The family erupted as if he had performed a miracle. Eleanor insisted on taking photos while George proposed a toast to Leo's good fortune and financial acumen. And that was how the Sterling family worked. 1,000 small cruelties accumulating year after year like sediment. Eleanor consistently forgot to set a place for me at holiday dinners until Julian noticed and mentioned it. George discussed finances with Julian while I sat right there, invisible as furniture, even though my salary had exceeded Julian's for the past 2 years. Leo borrowed money he never repaid, always joking that I probably tracked every penny in a spreadsheet. I did, though not for the reasons he assumed. At their weekly family dinners, my accomplishments became footnotes while Julian's mediocre sales numbers were dissected and praised as if he were revolutionizing his industry. The month I landed a contract worth $18 million for my firm, the dinner conversation focused entirely on Julian closing a deal worth less than my monthly commission. When I mentioned my achievement, Eleanor said, "That's nice, dear," and immediately asked Julian about his prospects for the next quarter. Those patterns pushed me into my own small rebellion. 3 years ago, I opened a savings account Julian knew nothing about. Every freelance project I took, every lunch I skipped, every coffee I didn't buy went into that account. I watched the balance grow slowly, each deposit a quiet act of defiance against their assumption that everything I earned belonged to Julian by default. The cabin had been my first major purchase from that account. 2 acres of pine forest 40 miles from our suburban life, with a creaky deck overlooking a small pond. When Julian discovered it through a credit report he pulled for a car loan application, his rage filled our house for weeks. Eleanor and George arrived within hours of his call, ready to lecture me about marriage being about transparency and trust. "What kind of wife keeps secrets?" Eleanor demanded while George questioned my mental stability. But the cabin became my sanctuary. Every Friday afternoon I drove north with my coffee and notebooks, spending weekends in peaceful silence. Julian refused to visit, calling it my midlife crisis shack. His family created a narrative where my cabin represented everything wrong with our marriage. My selfishness, my impracticality, my failure to be a proper wife. 4 months ago, my firm won a major contract with Apex Defense Solutions. The assignment required someone with high-level security clearance to coordinate offices across Asia. The selection committee chose me over 12 other candidates, recognizing my expertise in international compliance. Julian's first response wasn't pride. It was suspicion. "Why would they send a woman alone overseas?" he asked, while Eleanor suggested I was abandoning my marital duties. Before leaving, I arranged everything meticulously. Because of my clearance, the cabin's ownership had been registered with federal databases, a detail that transformed my simple property into a protected asset. I left Julian detailed emergency-only instructions, automated all payments, and hired a property management service. His dismissive laugh when I explained the precautions still echoed in my memory. Now, sitting at that dinner table and watching him bask in his family's approval for selling my cabin, my sanctuary, my achievement, my freedom, I felt my phone vibrating again in my pocket. The caller ID read Edward Hayes. I had never heard of him before, but somehow I knew this call would explain why Julian's proud announcement was about to become the worst decision of his life. I excused myself from the table and stepped onto the sterling back porch with my phone pressed to my ear. Edward Hayes's voice trembled through the speaker as he described federal agents examining documents and asking questions about property sales that required special clearances. Behind me, through the glass doors, Julian was pulling papers from a leather folder, showing his family the details of his brilliant transaction while Eleanor poured more wine. 3 years earlier, the journey to that cabin had started with a different phone call. Martha Jenkins, the elderly owner, had a voice like warm honey when she first described the property. "It's not fancy," she warned. "My husband built most of it himself after he retired from the railroad. But there's something special about those woods. They know how to keep secrets." I drove out there on a Tuesday morning when Julian thought I was at a dental appointment. The narrow dirt road wound through towering pines that filtered the October light into golden patches. When the trees opened to reveal the cabin, something in my chest uncloaked for the first time in years. 2 stories of weathered cedar siding, a metal roof gone green with age, and a deck that was slightly tilted but solid, overlooking a pond so still it looked like polished glass. Martha was waiting on the front steps, her white hair pinned back, wearing a flannel shirt that probably belonged to her late husband. She led me through each room, running her weathered hands along the door frames and windowsills, the way someone touches old photographs when it is time to say goodbye. In the main bedroom, she stopped by the east-facing window. "Arthur always said the sunrise through these pines was better than church," she said quietly. I think he was right. When she named her price, it was well below market value, reduced by $30,000. "I don't need the money," she explained, studying my face with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "I need to know this place is going to someone who needs it the way Arthur and I did. Someone who understands that sometimes 4 walls and silence are the only medicine that works." The down payment represented 3 years of skipped lunches, declined dinner invitations, and clothes worn far past their prime. Every dollar I saved was a small act of rebellion against the Sterling family's assumption that I existed only as an extension of Julian. My hands shook as I signed the papers in Martha's kitchen, using my maiden name, Clara Vance, on every line. When she handed me the keys, they felt heavier than metal should, weighted with possibility. For 2 weeks I kept my secret. I drove out alone, walked through my rooms, sat on my deck, and breathed air that belonged to me. I fixed small things. A cabinet door that would not close, a faucet that dripped. I learned from hardware store employees and late-night YouTube videos. Each repair felt like reclaiming a piece of myself the Sterlings had tried to erase. Julian's discovery came by accident. He decided to refinance his precious BMW and needed my signature on the credit application. The loan officer's computer screen faced me as she pulled our credit reports, and there it was in plain black and white. Recent inquiry, Blackwood Lending Group. Julian's face moved from confusion to comprehension to rage in the span of 3 seconds. The drive home was silent. Once inside, the explosion came. You bought property without telling me. With what money? His voice rose with every question. Within an hour, Eleanor's Lexus screeched into our driveway, followed closely by George's Mercedes. Julian had summoned his parents like reinforcements. They positioned themselves in our living room as if it were a courtroom. Eleanor sat perfectly straight on the sofa, her pearls catching the light as she leaned forward. "Clara, darling," she began, using that tone that turned endearment into a threat. "Help us understand what kind of wife makes major financial decisions without consulting her husband." George stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, speaking as if he were delivering a boardroom presentation. "This raises serious concerns about your mental state. Hidden money. Secret purchases. These are not the actions of a stable person." I sat in the chair they had positioned to face all three of them, my hands folded in my lap. "The cabin cost $70,000, I said evenly. "I paid for it entirely with my own freelance earnings. It did not affect our joint finances." "That's not the point." Julian's fist hit the coffee table, making Eleanor's teacup rattle. "We're supposed to be partners. Partners don't keep secrets." The irony of him talking about partnership, when he had not noticed my absence for dozens of Saturdays, had never asked about my freelance projects, and had forgotten our last 3 anniversaries, was almost physical. I said nothing. I had learned long ago that defending myself only gave them more ammunition. The following months turned into a slow war of attrition. Julian refused to visit the cabin, calling it my midlife crisis shack to anyone who would listen. His family built a story in which my cabin symbolized everything wrong with our marriage. My selfishness, my deception, my failure to be a proper wife. They repeated that story at every family gathering and to every mutual friend until it became accepted truth that poor Julian was married to an unstable woman who hid money and bought property behind his back. Still, every Friday afternoon I packed a small bag and drove north. Those weekends saved me. I learned to replace broken boards, to identify bird calls, to grow tomatoes in containers on the deck. I filled journals with thoughts I could never say out loud. The cabin learned my secrets. How I dreaded Sunday dinners. How I sometimes sat in my car for 10 minutes, gathering the strength to walk into my own house. How I marked days on a private calendar, not counting down to anything but proving to myself that I was still surviving. Eleanor escalated her campaign with what she called a family meeting, but what was really an intervention. She arrived with a PowerPoint presentation. Actual slides detailing the cabin's supposed maintenance costs, liability risks, and drain on our resources. She had researched septic failures, roof replacements, and property tax increases, presenting each as an inevitable disaster. Leo joked about me becoming a hermit, asking if I was growing marijuana in the woods. George questioned whether I was meeting someone there, the implication unmistakable. Julian stayed silent, letting them speak for him as he always did. His silence cut deeper than their words. When they finally stopped, I pulled out my phone and showed them photos. The garden I had planted, now full of herbs and vegetables. The desk by the window where morning light poured in. The bookshelves I had built myself, slightly crooked but solid. Their expressions did not change. They saw only time spent away from them, energy invested in something they did not control. They looked at my photos for exactly 3 seconds before Eleanor closed my phone and handed it back with the same expression she used when returning spoiled food at a restaurant. "Well," she said, adjusting her pearls, "I suppose everyone needs their hobbies." The word hobbies dripped with enough condescension to fill the pond behind my cabin. 2 months after that disastrous intervention, everything shifted. My managing director, Robert Thorne, called me into his office on a Monday morning in February. From the 32nd floor, the city lay wrapped in winter fog. Robert stood against the window like a general planning a campaign. "We've won the Apex Defense Solutions contract," he said without preamble. 4 months coordinating their satellite offices across Asia. "It's worth $18 million to the firm, and I need someone with your specific expertise. The project required high-level security clearance because of federal defense work." 12 candidates had been reviewed. My name sat at the top of the list, circled twice in Robert's distinctive red pen. Your background check came back spotless, he said, sliding the folder across his desk. Your experience with international compliance is unmatched here. The client specifically asked for someone with your qualifications. I accepted immediately, the word yes leaving my mouth before I could second-guess myself. 4 months away from the Sterlings felt like oxygen after years of suffocation. Robert smiled in a way that suggested he understood more about my home life than I had ever said out loud. You leave in 3 weeks. The pay difference is substantial. Hazard pay. Overseas adjustment. We are talking about doubling your quarterly income. That evening I told Julian over dinner, watching his fork freeze halfway to his mouth. His questions carried calculation, not concern. Why would they send you? Why not Bradley or Arjun? They have more seniority. Because I have the security clearance and the expertise, I replied, keeping my voice neutral despite the familiar sting. A woman alone in Asia for 4 months, he muttered, returning to his plate. Seems unnecessary. Can't you do it remotely? Within an hour, Eleanor called. Clara dear, she said, her voice sharp through the speaker. I just heard about this overseas assignment. Don't you think it's selfish? Leaving your husband for months. Marriage requires sacrifice, and it seems you're only interested in your career. 3 days later, the security briefing revealed complications I had not expected. Agent Maya Rodriguez from the Federal Security Agency explained that all personal assets had to be registered in federal databases. Your cabin in Blackwood Canyon, she said, reading from her tablet, will be flagged as property belonging to a cleared contractor working on sensitive projects. That status provides additional protection against foreign interference or suspicious activity. My simple cabin had just become a federally monitored asset. The irony was impossible to ignore. The property Julian and his family had dismissed as worthless was now under government protection. I spent the next 3 days preparing for my absence with careful, methodical precision. The property management company I hired came highly recommended, known for handling homes belonging to deployed military families. Every utility payment was automated and backed up, with the management company listed as a secondary payer. I installed security cameras that uploaded directly to cloud storage I could access from anywhere in the world. The emergency folder I prepared for Julian contained 15 pages of detailed instructions. Emergency contacts, utility companies, maintenance schedules, and clear warnings about the cabin's federal status. I highlighted emergency access only in yellow marker and underlined it 3 times. Julian flipped through the pages with barely concealed amusement. It's just a shack in the woods, Clara, not Fort Knox, he laughed, tossing the folder onto the kitchen counter. It stayed there untouched for the next 4 months. The humidity in Singapore hit me like a solid wall when I stepped off the plane, but the sense of freedom outweighed any physical discomfort. My hotel room overlooked Marina Bay, the city lights scattering across the water like broken diamonds. That first night I stood on the balcony and felt my shoulders finally drop from the place where they had lived for years. 4 months without being dismissed, ignored, or belittled stretched ahead of me like a promise. The work was demanding but exhilarating. I uncovered a network of compliance issues that had already cost Apex Defense Solutions millions in potential fines. My daily reports to Robert were met with steady praise, something that still felt unfamiliar after years of Julian's indifference. The client was impressed enough to request an extension, which I declined politely. 4 months was my limit. My weekly video calls with Julian became a quiet lesson in fading interest. At first, he managed about 10 minutes of conversation, asking routine questions about my work while his focus drifted toward his computer screen. By the 3rd week, he was attending Eleanor's dinners during our scheduled calls, family voices filling the background and drowning out any chance of a real conversation. Your absence is barely noticed, Eleanor said once, loud enough to carry through the phone, followed by laughter I recognized as Leo's. Her emails arrived every Sunday evening without fail. She forwarded articles about career women who lost their families and historical stories about wives who abandoned their duties for personal ambition. Each message ended with, "Concerned for your marriage, Eleanor," as if her concern had ever extended beyond control. One morning, the family group chat I had belonged to for 6 years displayed a single message. You are no longer a participant in this conversation. No explanation. No warning. Julian claimed it was a technical issue when I asked, but his social media told another story. Photos from family dinners showed him seated between Eleanor and George, with Emily, Leo's girlfriend, sitting in the place that had once been mine. The captions read like quiet announcements of my erasure. Great evening with the whole family. Complete at last. My cabin security cameras became my connection to something real. Every morning I checked the feeds while drinking coffee, watching deer pass through the trees or rain ripple across the pond. The weekly reports from the management company were brief. All systems normal. No issues to report. They offered more comfort than Julian's increasingly infrequent messages. By the 3rd month, Julian stopped answering my calls entirely. My texts received one-word replies hours later. Busy. Fine. Later. His social media, however, showed endless availability. Dinners with colleagues, drinks with Leo, concerts with people I did not recognize. Emily appeared in more and more photos, always laughing at something Julian had said, her hand resting on his shoulder in a way that was not casual at all. In the last photo he posted, her manicured hand was there again. Her smile was too bright, her closeness too familiar. The timestamp showed last Tuesday, the same night he claimed to be working late on quarterly reports. I closed my laptop and stared out at the Singapore skyline, the city's pulse vibrating through my hotel window as I processed what those images meant. This was no longer simple indifference. It was something else entirely. The flight home lasted 16 hours and crossed 3 time zones. Plenty of time to prepare myself for whatever awaited me in Chicago. I texted Julian my arrival time twice and received no reply. When the plane landed on Thursday afternoon, the October air carried that sharp Midwest chill that cuts straight through you. I waited 40 minutes at baggage claim, watching families reunite, couples embrace, drivers holding signs for strangers. Julian never appeared. Finally, a message arrived. Mom's preparing a special dinner for your return. Come straight here. The taxi driver loaded my suitcase into the trunk while I stared at the screen. A special dinner at Eleanor's. After 4 months away, my husband could not even meet me at the airport, but his family was clearly preparing something. As we passed our neighborhood, I asked the driver to slow down. Through the living room window, I saw furniture I did not recognize. A leather sectional where our blue sofa used to be. Artwork on walls that had been bare when I left. 2 unfamiliar cars sat in the driveway. A BMW newer than Julian's and a red sports car. The garden I had carefully maintained for 3 years was gone, replaced with generic landscaping. Is this your house? The driver asked, noticing my stare. I'm not sure anymore, I answered honestly. I asked him to stop at the corner and pulled my suitcase the rest of the way, like a stranger approaching an unfamiliar home. My key still worked. The house inside did not feel like mine. The leather furniture was expensive. The artwork was abstract, safe, tasteless, and costly, exactly the kind Eleanor approved of. The kitchen had been completely reorganized. My spice rack was gone, replaced by decorative containers that likely held nothing. In the bedroom, the sheets were different. Egyptian cotton, still sharply creased from the packaging. Julian's clothes had spread into my side of the closet, while my remaining things were pushed into a corner. On the dresser sat a bottle of perfume I did not recognize. It was not mine. I left my suitcase unopened and drove straight to the Sterling house. My hand stayed steady on the steering wheel despite the exhaustion weighing on my body. Their driveway looked like a luxury car showroom. Eleanor's Lexus. George's Mercedes. Leo's Range Rover. Julian's BMW. 2 more vehicles I did not recognize. The house glowed with warm light, shadows moving behind the curtains like a rehearsed performance. The front door was unlocked. I heard voices from the dining room, laughter carrying the unmistakable sound of celebration. Eleanor's voice rose above the rest. He handled it brilliantly. Absolutely brilliantly. I stood in the hallway listening to my absence being celebrated before stepping forward. The scene had been arranged with care. like a photograph staged for a magazine spread. Eleanor's heirloom crystal, the set she reserved for Christmas dinners and engagement announcements, sparkled under the chandelier. Decanters of wine that cost more than my weekly groceries stood open on the table. Everyone had dressed for an occasion. Eleanor wore pearls and silk. George sat in his golf club blazer. Leo looked uncomfortable in what was clearly a brand new suit. Julian stood at the head of the table, occupying the seat I usually took when we hosted, wearing the expression of a man who believed he had won everything. Clara, Eleanor's voice carried that familiar false warmth. Perfect timing. We were just about to toast. They were arranged around the table like an audience in a theater, each face holding that barely contained anticipation that always preceded major announcements. Emily was there too, seated beside Leo but angled toward Julian, her hand resting close to his wine glass. "Welcome home," Julian said, not moving from his position of power at the head of the table. "How was the flight?" Before I could answer, he lifted his glass, commanding attention with an authority I had never seen him use before. "Actually, before we eat, I have something important to share." He paused, savoring the moment. "You all know about Clara's little cabin," he said, his tone dismissive. "That impractical purchase from 3 years ago." My shoulders tightened at the way he said little cabin as if it were a child's toy. "Well, I finally took care of it," he continued. "I sold it for $100,000 last month while she was overseas." The words seemed to hang in the air. Then the room erupted. George offered a polite golf clap. Eleanor let out a delighted gasp. Leo whistled appreciatively. Emily clapped too, her eyes never leaving Julian's face. He gestured toward the elaborate spread on the table, dishes I recognized from the expensive French restaurant downtown. "The money for this dinner," he said lightly. "It's from the cabin sale. At least one meal is covered." They laughed. A casual joke. A celebration of the fact that he had taken my sanctuary and turned it into their entertainment. I remained completely still. My silence was total. My phone began vibrating in my pocket. Julian pulled out a leather folder, the kind favored by expensive attorneys, and spread the documents across Eleanor's immaculate tablecloth. "The best part," he said proudly, running a finger along the pages, "is that I handled everything myself. Researched comparable properties, managed 3 competing bids, saved thousands on agent fees." "Brilliant," George murmured, leaning forward to examine the paperwork. "Absolutely brilliant business instinct. How did you handle the signature issue?" Leo asked, genuinely curious. Julian's smile widened. "Spent 3 days practicing. Got it perfect. Just the initial C." He pointed to the signature lines. Each one carried my name in handwriting that was close to mine but not quite right. The slant was off. The final stroke too sharp. Eleanor studied the documents with approval. "That," she said, "is what I call resourcefulness." My phone buzzed again. Edward Hayes, attorney at law. The name meant nothing to me, and yet something in my gut told me this call would change everything in this room. I stepped away from the table, pressing the phone to my ear as I moved toward the French doors leading to Eleanor's pristine back porch. Through the glass, I watched Julian refill wine glasses, continuing his performance for his captivated audience. Eleanor touched his arm affectionately, the proud mother admiring her clever son. Emily laughed at something Leo said, but her eyes followed Julian with interest that went beyond polite attention. "What can I help you with, Mr. Hayes?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Why are federal authorities at our office?" The words rushed out of him, his composure completely gone. "They're examining documents, asking about restricted property sales, talking about fraudulent transfers. They've seized our files." "Federal authorities?" I repeated. "What kind of property did your husband sell us?" I stepped farther onto the porch, the October air sharp against my travel-worn skin. "Mr. Hayes," I said carefully, "I have been overseas for 4 months. This is the first I am hearing about any sale. You will need to explain exactly which transaction you are referring to." "The Blackwood Canyon cabin," he said, his breathing audible. "Your husband provided all documentation. We closed the deal 6 weeks ago. $100,000 was transferred to your joint account. But now agents are here talking about federal property registrations and security clearances. They're using words like fraud, he added. Forgery. 6 weeks ago, while I was in Singapore documenting compliance violations that would save Apex Defense Solutions millions, Julian had been forging my signature on federally flagged documents. The irony was almost beautiful. Mr. Hayes, I said evenly, I need to review some documents and make a few calls. I will contact you within the hour. I ended the call and stood in Eleanor's meticulously maintained garden, surrounded by roses she paid someone else to tend, absorbing what I had just learned. My phone showed 3 missed calls from a blocked number. Then a text appeared from a number I recognized immediately. Agent Maya Rodriguez. We had met during my security clearance renewal 6 months earlier. Thorough. Unforgiving. Her message was brief. Mrs. Sterling, we are aware of the situation regarding your Blackwood Canyon property. Maintain normal behavior. Attend family dinner as planned. Keep subjects unaware. Team mobilizing. The message had arrived 2 hours earlier while my plane was descending into Chicago. The federal databases tracking my cabin as a protected asset had flagged the unauthorized transfer before I had even landed. I thought about the security briefing before Singapore. Agent Maya Rodriguez's careful explanation of how property owned by cleared contractors became part of a larger protective framework. The cabin was not just mine. It was locked into systems Julian never knew existed. Through the window, I watched him stand again at the head of the table, hands moving expressively as he continued explaining how clever he had been. Eleanor's face glowed with maternal pride. George nodded along approvingly. They looked like a painting of perfect familial satisfaction, completely unaware that their golden son had just confessed to federal crimes. I returned to the dining room, slipping my phone back into my pocket as it vibrated again. Julian paused mid-sentence when he saw me. Important call? He asked, though his tone made it clear he did not care. Just work, I replied calmly. Following up on some documentation. I took my seat at the far end of the table, the place they had assigned me like an afterthought. Julian laughed softly, the familiar edge of condescension in the sound. Always working, he said with a thin smile. Even fresh off the plane. You really should learn to relax, Clara. He turned back to his audience, clearly enjoying himself, eager to continue the story he had been building all evening. The best part, he said, was getting access to all the necessary documents. While Clara was gallivanting across Asia, I took the initiative to organize our financial papers. Everything was right there in her home office. The deed, the title, the insurance documents, all sitting neatly in her little safe. He chuckled. The combination. She never even bothered to change it from our anniversary date. Brilliant, George murmured, nodding approvingly. Taking control of wasteful assets. That's what a real businessman does. Eleanor nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Why let money sit idle in some cabin when it could be invested properly? Julian has been reviewing some excellent opportunities connected to Leo's new venture. Leo leaned forward, suddenly energized. We could absolutely use that capital injection. My partner thinks we could triple the investment within 18 months. They were already dividing up my money, discussing the proceeds of Julian's theft as if it were a group victory. Not a single person at that table asked why I had not been consulted about selling my own property. The assumption of Julian's authority was so complete, so unquestioned, that none of them even considered the possibility of a crime. Your signature work was impressive, Leo said, grinning broadly at Julian. Honestly, I couldn't tell the difference from the real thing. 3 days of practice, Julian replied proudly. I used her old journals to study her handwriting. The key is pressure. The way she curves certain letters. Emily finally spoke, her voice light and sweet in a way that never reached her eyes. You must be so proud, Clara. Julian really took charge while you were gone. I met her gaze steadily, noticing how her hand had drifted closer to Julian's on the table, their fingers nearly touching. Oh yes, I said calmly. He certainly took charge of something that wasn't his to take. For a brief moment the words seemed to linger in the air. Then Julian laughed. "Everything in a marriage is ours, darling. That's what partnership means." My phone vibrated again. Another message from Agent Maya Rodriguez. 15 minutes. I glanced at Eleanor's grandfather clock. The second hand swept past the top of the dial. 14 minutes had already passed since her last message. Julian had moved on, confidently outlining his plans for investing the $100,000, speaking with the assurance of a man who believed he had escaped all consequences. Eleanor began serving her homemade tiramisu, the dessert she reserved for special victories, when the first black vehicle pulled silently into the driveway. Its headlights swept across the dining room windows like searchlights. A second vehicle followed. Then a third. Each positioned with deliberate military precision. Through the sheer curtains I could see the government plates. The kind that made neighbors quietly pull back their blinds and wonder what level of trouble had arrived on their street. 6 figures stepped out, moving with synchronized efficiency. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. The sudden movement made Emily's wine glass wobble. "I'll get the door," I said, even though no one had knocked yet. Julian barely looked at me. He was still explaining to George how he planned to leverage the cabin money into a larger real estate portfolio. I reached the front door just as Agent Maya Rodriguez raised her hand to knock. She stood flanked by 5 other agents, all in dark suits that projected unmistakable federal authority. Her eyes met mine with professional recognition. She remembered me from the security clearance interview, the hours I had spent answering questions about every aspect of my life. "Mrs. Sterling," she said quietly, "are all subjects present?" "They're in the dining room," I replied, stepping aside. "All of them. They're having dessert." The agents moved through Eleanor's hallway with practiced precision, their footsteps deliberate on the polished hardwood floors. Each step sounded like a countdown. The dining room fell silent as 6 federal agents entered and spread out, smoothly blocking every exit. Julian's fork froze halfway to his mouth. A piece of tiramisu slid off and stained Eleanor's heirloom tablecloth. George's face drained of color so quickly it looked as though he might faint. Leo pushed his chair back as if he could disappear into the wallpaper. Emily's eyes darted between the agents and the door, calculating distances she would never reach. "Julian Sterling," Agent Maya Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying a weight that made everything else in the room feel suddenly insignificant. She held up her badge, the gold shield catching the light from the chandelier. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit interstate commerce violations." The words landed like physical blows. Julian's wine glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. Red liquid spread across Eleanor's Persian rug like blood. "This is insane," he shouted, jumping to his feet. "It was just a property deal. A simple real estate transaction." Agent Maya Rodriguez stepped toward him with calm, unhurried confidence. "Selling federally registered property using forged documents is not a simple transaction, Mr. Sterling," she said. "It is a federal crime." The handcuffs appeared in her hands, the metal closing around Julian's wrists with a sound that left no room for misunderstanding. Eleanor screamed. "There's been a mistake." Her hands flew to her pearls as if they could protect her from reality. "This is a misunderstanding. Julian was just being resourceful. We need to call our lawyer." George stood, trying to summon the authority he used in boardrooms. His voice shook. "You can't just come into our home." "Sir, please sit down," another agent said calmly. It was not a request. George sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every year of his age. The agents began documenting the scene. One photographed the forged documents still spread across the table. Julian's proud explanation transformed into evidence. Another documented the champagne bottles, the catered food, the elaborate dinner funded with stolen money. A third agent collected the family's phones, ignoring Emily's protests and Leo's claims that he had nothing to do with this. Julian turned toward me. His face shifted rapidly, confusion, anger, desperation, before settling into something that looked like betrayal. "Clara," he pleaded. "Tell them this is a misunderstanding. You're my wife. Tell them I had every right to sell that property. I met his gaze in silence. The same silence I had perfected over 6 years of being dismissed, ignored, and belittled. The silence that had once trapped me now became my power. I said nothing. Wives can't testify against husbands, he said desperately. You can't do this to me. I was helping our finances. I was being smart. Agent Maya Rodriguez paused as she secured his hands behind his back. Actually, Mr. Sterling, she said evenly, spouses can testify in federal cases involving crimes against each other. She continued, but more importantly, we don't need your wife's testimony. The evidence you provided tonight, your detailed confession, the forged documents, and the fraudulent sale of federally registered property, is more than sufficient. She looked at me then. Her expression remained professional, but there was something else in her eyes. Understanding. Agent Maya Rodriguez turned back as Julian Sterling was led toward the door. Mr. Sterling, you will be required to appear at the federal building tomorrow to provide a formal statement, she said evenly. Our financial crimes unit has uncovered additional irregularities that extend well beyond the cabin sale. Eleanor's gasp was sharp and unmistakable. Additional irregularities, Agent Maya Rodriguez repeated, then shifted her attention to Julian's parents. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, you will both need to come in for questioning as well. She paused deliberately. Your names appear on several suspicious transfers connected to this case. At this point, it appears the cabin sale was only the beginning. Our forensic accountants have identified evidence of systematic embezzlement from joint accounts, concealed investments, and a sustained pattern of financial fraud stretching back several years. The family that had spent 6 years applauding Julian's smallest achievements while dismissing everything I accomplished now sat motionless, watching their golden son escorted away in handcuffs. Their carefully maintained hierarchy of judgment and casual cruelty was collapsing in real time, brought down by Julian's arrogance and their own enthusiasm for celebrating his crimes. Leo stood frozen against the dining room wall as one of the agents began reading him his rights as a material witness. Emily had collapsed into a chair, mascara streaking down her cheeks as she repeatedly insisted she barely knew anyone there, despite the photographs on Julian's phone showing her at family gatherings over the past 8 months. Eleanor clutched at the nearest agent, pleading to accompany her son, while George sat with his head in his hands, muttering about calling their attorney, who in a cruel twist of irony had been disbarred 2 years earlier for his own financial misconduct. The next morning arrived with a clarity that felt unreal. I sat in my kitchen now, not ours, drinking coffee from a mug I had bought for myself in Singapore, watching the sunrise wash the walls in gold. My phone had been vibrating nonstop since midnight. Calls from unfamiliar numbers. Journalists who had somehow obtained my contact information. And repeated attempts from Eleanor, despite explicit instructions from federal agents not to contact me. The first domino fell within 48 hours. Premier Title Services, the company that had processed Julian's fraudulent sale, opened its doors Monday morning to federal investigators. By noon, its operating license had been suspended pending investigation. The owner, Bradley Morrison, gave a panicked interview to local news outlets, insisting they had followed standard procedures. The forged documents Julian had provided were so blatantly fraudulent that the company's failure to verify authorization amounted to gross negligence. Morrison's 30-year career in real estate ended before the day was over. 3 real estate agents who had advised Julian on pricing and strategy soon faced consequences of their own. Jennifer Patterson, who had supplied comparable sales data, lost her license after investigators discovered she had never verified Julian's ownership of the property. Robert Clean, who had connected Julian with potential buyers, was found to have ignored multiple warning signs in the documentation. Sandra Marsh, who had proudly celebrated the sale on her professional social media, claiming credit for facilitating another successful transaction, watched her 20-year career unravel when screenshots of her posts became evidence of professional negligence. Eleanor's social media posts proved especially damaging. Her public declaration, "My brilliant son just made the deal of the year," accompanied by photographs of the celebration dinner, had been shared 16 times before the arrests. Neighbors who had long found the Sterlings insufferable eagerly supplied investigators with screenshots. A post from 3 weeks earlier, praising Julian for taking charge, while his wife traveled across Asia, was entered as evidence of premeditation. The country club acquaintances she had once boasted to now crossed the street to avoid her. Edward Hayes's law firm collapsed just as dramatically. The buyers, an innocent couple named David and Jennifer Miller, who had believed they were purchasing a quiet weekend retreat, filed suit against everyone involved. Their complaint named Hayes's firm, the title company, all 3 real estate agents, Julian, and initially attempted to include me, until their attorney realized I was the victim. Hayes's partners voted him out within a week. His name was removed from the building directory before the ink had dried on the federal subpoenas. 6 months of investigation revealed that Julian's deception extended far beyond the cabin. Federal forensic accountants uncovered years of siphoned funds from our joint accounts, money funneled into failed ventures and unauthorized loans to family members. Every transaction told the same story of entitlement and theft. $20,000 sent to Leo for a so-called revolutionary dropshipping business that never shipped a single product. $15,000 to George for golf club memberships and gambling debts he had concealed from Eleanor. A steady stream of smaller withdrawals, $500 here, $1,000 there, that paid for lunches, gifts, and weekend trips I had never known about. Trips taken with Emily. Gifts for a relationship that had quietly developed while I worked overseas. Judge Patricia Thornton presided over Julian's sentencing with the weary composure of someone who had seen too many entitled men convinced the rules did not apply to them. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago loomed with architecture designed to remind defendants exactly how much power they did not have. Julian sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit him. 6 months in federal detention had stripped away his casual arrogance, and 15 pounds along with it. "Your Honor," Julian began during allocution, his voice lacking the authority that once commanded boardrooms and family dinners. "I meant no harm. I was simply trying to maximize underutilized assets. In marriage, property is shared. I believed I had the right to make financial decisions for our family's benefit." Judge Thornton removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly before responding. "Mr. Sterling, you have just admitted to premeditation and systematic planning," she said. "You did not make a financial decision. You committed wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Your explanation that you researched prices, practiced signatures, and avoided legal fees does not lessen your responsibility. It confirms it." The sentence fell like a sledgehammer. 4 years in federal prison. No possibility of early release. Plus $285,000 in restitution. The man who had committed federal crimes to avoid $1,000 in legal fees now owed more than he would earn in a decade. The courtroom filled with whispers as the figure settled in. Julian's attorney, a public defender after no private lawyer would accept his case, slumped in his chair. Eleanor and George faced their own reckoning. Investigators determined they had received more than $50,000 in stolen funds over the years. Money spent on cruise vacations and country club fees, despite knowing their son's income could never support such generosity. They appeared before a different judge 2 weeks later, their attorney arguing they were merely naive parents who had trusted their son. The prosecutor's response was decisive. Email records showed they had actively encouraged Julian to take control of family finances while I was overseas. Leo shocked everyone by cooperating immediately. Faced with potential conspiracy charges, he provided prosecutors with detailed testimony about family discussions concerning my cabin, Julian's planning sessions, and their parents' full awareness of the scheme, in exchange for probation and community service. He became the central witness against his own family. His testimony detailed years of casual conversations about my so-called wasteful spending strategies for accessing my accounts, and Eleanor's repeated suggestions that Julian handle things while I was abroad. When he finished, Leo looked directly at his parents. His voice was steady as he described years of financial manipulation he had observed, but never questioned, until federal agents placed the evidence in front of him. They knew, Leo said quietly. We all knew Clara's money was being taken. We just called it family finances. The courtroom went completely silent at that admission. Even the court reporter paused for a moment before resuming her transcription. 3 weeks after the final sentencing, I returned to my cabin for the first time since Julian's arrest. The property management company had maintained it flawlessly during the chaos, but now federal restitution funds had transformed it into something far beyond my original vision. The narrow dirt road leading in had been properly graded and covered with fresh gravel. New security cameras, discreet but comprehensive, monitored every approach. The front door now had a deadbolt system that required both a physical key and a code, installed by the same company that secured federal facilities. Inside, the transformation continued. The kitchen I had once planned to renovate someday had been completely rebuilt. New appliances, granite countertops, cabinets that closed smoothly instead of requiring the precise angle I had memorized. Every window had been replaced with triple-pane glass, turning the pine forest outside into a living painting, each needle sharply defined against the sky. The old creaky deck had been reinforced and extended, now wrapping around 2 sides of the cabin with built-in benches facing the pond. Agent Maya Rodriguez arrived on a Tuesday morning, pulling in with her personal car rather than a government vehicle. She carried 2 cups of coffee from the small shop in town, remembering that I preferred oat milk without my ever mentioning it. We sat on the new deck, the October air crisp but gentle, watching mist rise from the pond. The investigation has expanded, she said. Her professional tone was softened by something that might have been admiration. Your case cracked open something much bigger. Julian had been running similar schemes with 3 other families, targeting women whose assets he could access through his position at the bank. She explained how my cabin's federal protection had acted as the tripwire that exposed everything. Without that classification, Julian might have continued indefinitely, stealing from women who trusted institutions where he held influence. Federal agents recovered nearly $500,000 in stolen funds, though much of it had already been spent on the Sterling family's lifestyle. The divorce proceedings took place entirely through attorneys. Illinois law showed little mercy to incarcerated spouses who committed financial crimes against their partners. The judge, an older woman named Carolyn Foster, reviewed the evidence with visible disgust. Mrs. Vance, she said, using my reclaimed maiden name, the court awards you all marital assets without exception. Everything came to me. The suburban house filled with expensive furniture I never wanted. The joint savings Julian had not managed to drain. The investment accounts he had hidden poorly. Even Eleanor's heirloom crystal, the set she had specifically designated for Julian in her will. The crystal was especially satisfying. 12 place settings of Waterford that had been in her family for generations now sat boxed in my basement, waiting to be donated to charity. Julian's letters began arriving 6 weeks into his sentence. The first was angry, accusing me of orchestrating everything, of knowing about the federal protection and setting him up. The second arrived a month later, steeped in self-pity, lamenting his circumstances and the unfairness of his situation. By the third letter, hints of understanding crept in, not remorse but recognition that his clever plan had never been clever at all. I found out about the federal property classifications, he wrote in what would be his final letter. They explained it during legal education class here. I should have asked questions. I should have asked you. He never apologized. He never acknowledged the years of theft before the cabin. He never mentioned the damage of being invisible inside my own marriage. He simply stopped writing. Perhaps at last he understood that his words, like his presence, were no longer welcome in my life. The local newspaper ran the story for weeks. Suburban scandal. Wife's cabin exposes years of financial fraud, became the most read article in the paper's digital history. Reporters called constantly, offering payment for exclusive interviews, promising to tell my side of the story. I declined them all. The investigation's findings were public record. Pages of documentation spoke far more clearly than any interview ever could. The facts were vindication enough. Julian in federal prison. His parents financially ruined by restitution payments. Their reputation destroyed by their own greed. My neighbors' attitudes shifted completely. Where once they had seen Julian's quiet wife, the woman who rarely spoke at block parties, they now saw someone who had endured years of financial abuse while quietly building her own success. Janet from next door brought casseroles during the divorce proceedings. Mike across the street offered to mow my lawn without payment. Invitations to coffee dates and book clubs multiplied. I politely declined most of them, choosing the solitude I had earned. My consulting work flourished in ways I had never anticipated. My experience in international compliance, combined with the visibility of my case, made me highly sought after. Companies wanted someone who understood both the technical complexity and the human cost of financial crime. My rates tripled, then quadrupled. Working from the cabin's converted second bedroom, overlooking the pond through those crystal-clear windows, I earned more in 6 months than Julian had stolen in 6 years. Martha Jenkins, the elderly woman who had sold me the cabin, sent a card on the anniversary of the sale. "I knew you needed this place," she wrote in careful cursive. "Arthur would be pleased to know it sheltered you when you needed it most." On the first anniversary of that dinner, the terrible, wonderful dinner when Julian proudly announced his crime to his applauding family, I sat on my reinforced deck as the sun set through the pines. The wine was nothing special. Just a bottle from the local grocery store, chosen because I liked the label. No one judged that choice. No one commented on its price or vintage. The silence around me was complete, broken only by natural sounds. Wind moving through pine needles. Water lapping at the pond's edge. An owl calling from somewhere in the darkness. My phone rested silent on the table beside me. No family group chats. No passive-aggressive messages from Eleanor. No dismissive texts from Julian. The absence of their voices revealed how much space they had once occupied. How their constant judgment had shaped my days. If this story of justice served cold kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. My favorite moment was when Clara stayed silent at the dinner table while the federal agents arrived, already knowing exactly what was coming next. What was your favorite moment? Tell me in the comments below. And don't miss more stories like this. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload.